Is Loki one giant time loop? Welcome back to Nerdist News, I'm Dan Casey, and today we're breaking down the penultimate episode of Loki Season 2. Episode 5, titled Science Fiction, picked up in the aftermath of last week's shocking ending. With the sacred timeline in shambles and the fate of the TVA hanging in the balance, Loki has to quite literally race against time to figure out a way to put things right. It's an affecting episode that answered major questions about our key characters. It gave us a glimpse at a dark future and gave us some clues about what's really happening this season. It also raised a burning question. Is this all just a giant time loop? It also raised another burning question. Is this all just a giant time loop? We're going to break down Loki's fiction problem in just a moment, but to do so we have to spoil what happens in the latest episode of Loki. So if you haven't seen it yet and you're worried about that sort of thing, leave now before it's too late.
This is not happening again!
Okay, let's get into it, shall we? After going out with a bang last episode, this week Loki gave us a whimper, but in a good way. Episode 5 saw the God of Mischief dealing with the end of the world as he knows it, but he doesn't feel fine. That's because time keeps on slipping into the future, and the past, and all over the known universe. After the untimely death of Victor Timely, the sacred timeline has become this never-ending pasta bowl. But there's no one left to tend this proverbial Olive Garden, and we're all left to say when with no sense of what timeline we're actually on. Throughout the episode, the show teases us with the mystery of how exactly Loki can save the TVA and learn to control his time slipping. The title Science Fiction, science/fiction, speaks to the duality at the core of this episode.
Science fiction is a well-respected and thought-provoking genre.
These are the two paths that Loki must tread in order to ultimately figure out why he's trapped in a moment and he can't get out of it, and how to do so before everyone he loves is turned into humanicati. Now, as I mentioned before, the episode made us wonder if the show's been hiding the answer to its biggest question in plain sight the entire time. Is Loki one giant time loop? Well, it sure seems like it based on this episode. Causal loops and bootstrap paradoxes have been at the center of so much of Season 2's story. And, in a sense, the Season 1 story as well, if He Who Remains was telling the truth when he said he paved the way for every decision that Loki and Sylvie made. He Who Remains' backup plan in the event of his death was to have Ravonna Renslayer and Miss Minutes go back in time to alter the course of his variant's life, so they would in effect create a causal loop leading him back to the TVA. It was a perpetual motion machine to keep He Who Remains in control for all time, always. Now, Loki's been trying to use specious space-time science to solve their problems to no avail, and that's because it's not a science problem at all.
But it does sound like fiction.
By which we mean that Loki's attempts to apply scientific thinking to these fictional problems can only take him so far. There's only one real way for Loki to emerge triumphant, and that's by altering the logic and the arc of these causal loops. Instead of following this Ouroboros, this snake eating its tail forever and ever, Loki needs to instead become the author of his own story.
You are a writer.
Yes. Science fiction.
I'm doomed.
In a sense, it's that same quest for free will that's driven characters like Sylvie and Ravonna Renslayer through so much of this series. And in Renslayer's case, it looks like she was actually wrong about Loki after all.
It's not your story, Mr. Laufeyson. It never was.
Loki's search for his glorious purpose has been a centerpiece of the character's story arc in the MCU. It's something we've spent an awful lot of time thinking about and probably overthinking if we're being honest. Check out our video. Loki's glorious purpose is not that he's destined to lose, as that temporal echo of Sylvie mentions later in the episode. Rather, it's something Sylvie tells Loki in that bar in Oklahoma. We're all writing our own stories now. Go write yours. And that sense of authorship, of agency, of free will is why Loki was able to ultimately undo this episode's Infinity War moment to presumably help prevent the endgame of the sacred timeline in the finale.
I can rewrite the story.
Well, like most things in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the answer lies in the comics. In Loki, Agent of Asgard number 13, the God of Mischief and Lies shifted his perspective on what his powers actually allow him to do. After remembering what a lie really is, a story told, Loki was reborn with greater powers than before, and this time as the God of Stories. It's also something that journalist Matthew Jackson seemingly anticipated in his 2021 essay on Sci-Fi Wire about Loki's metafictional journey. journey. Because even if he does exist on someone else's timeline, even if he's consigned to live the same fate over and over again in an omniversal fiction machine, Loki's understanding that he was writing a character within himself gives him the power to rewrite at least a few things. It gives him the power to become a better version of who he was always supposed to be. So while the Loki series isn't adapting the Agent of Asgard storyline directly, the spirit of it and some of the character names seem the same, but more on that in just a moment. And besides, what could be more mischievous than altering the flow of time as we know it?
It'll be fun, though.
Yeah, it'll be really fun.
But before we get into how Loki plans on rewriting the story, let's address what major details we learned about its key players. As we suspected, everyone in the Time Variance Authority was somehow returned to the branch timelines where they originally came from. Now, some of the revelations were surprising, like learning that OB was a theoretical physicist with dreams of being a sci-fi author, or that Hunter B-15's deep well of empathy likely stems from the fact that she's a pediatrician. But she's someone near and dear to Loki in the comics. If you look closely at her name tag in the end credits, it reads Verity Willis. She first appeared in 2014's Loki Agent of Asgard comics and has the superpower to see through any lie, including Loki's. While she probably won't be Loki's BFF like in the comics, at least she'll call him and the TVA out on their BS. Also surprising was that A.D. Doug's warehouse home in Pasadena looked an awful lot like his workshop back in the TVA. And if you look closely, his publishing company is called KQB, and we can only assume that stands for Ki-Hee Kwan Books.
Hey, look at this. Here's a copy.
But most shocking of all was the truth about Casey. It turns out that he was a hardened criminal, but not just any criminal, one of only 3 men to ever escape Alcatraz. Just as Season 1 revealed the truth behind the mystery of D.B. Cooper, Season 2 revealed the truth behind yet another true crime question. What happened to Frank Morris? In June 1962, 3 inmates, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin, escaped from Alcatraz by using a makeshift raft. The men were never found, and it was believed they had died in the escape attempt. But as it turns out, one of them just found gainful employment at the TVA. Casey was Frank Morris.
You said your name was Frank.
It is. His name's Casey.
I don't know this guy. I don't know you.
And it's ironic considering how by the book he was in his other life.
Yeah. Haven't you read the TVA guidebook?
And also, it's worth noting the show went to great lengths to recreate the circumstances of this infamous escape, right down to the papier-mâché head that Morris left behind in his cell to fool the guards, and their hole-in-the-wall tunnel. They also gave us some bonus cameos with Loki directors Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead as John and Clarence Anglin, respectively. Frank warns his compatriots that if the guards catch them, they're gonna gut them like fish.
If they catch us, they're gonna gut us like fish.
And that's a fate that should sound familiar to anyone who remembers Casey's encounter with Loki in Season 1.
Give me the Tesseract or I'll gut you like a fish, Casey.
What's a fish?
And last but not least, we have what feels like the most obvious revelation of all in hindsight, and one that we've theorized about previously. Mobius M. Mobius wasn't always the TVA's pie-loving jet ski aficionado.
What?
He was once Don, a single dad in Cleveland, Ohio, who sold all manner of personal watercraft at Piranha Power Sports.
I sell jet skis, man.
It's a reveal that makes perfect sense and explains Mobius's deep-seated obsession with jet skis.
In the early 1990s, for a brief, shining moment, there was a beautiful union of form and function, which we call the jet ski.
A beautiful union of form and function.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
It also leads to one of the best visual gags of the series when Loki time-slips into Mobius's timeline doing the same dance as that wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man out front.
Wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. Wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. Wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man.
Now as for Sylvie, she's still living the same quiet, comfortable life in Broxton, Oklahoma circa 1982. She works at McDonald's, she's a regular at this bar with a vintage Zaniac arcade machine, and there's a cool record store in town. And yet her happiness and her happy meal are short-lived, as they soon turn to mixed spaghetti, which is usually only available in the Philippines and like one restaurant in Orlando. For a moment, Sylvie's portion of this story seems to point towards certain doom with the spaghettification of the record store, and that's really driven home by the Velvet Underground needle drop of Oh Sweet Nothin' playing in the background. Now for those who don't know, it's a song about broken, lonely people, which is fitting for most of the gang we see by the episode's end. Misery loves company, but through their friendship they have transcended that misery. So what's the deeper significance of Loki needing to assemble his friends together, or should I call them pen pals?
The pens. We have all the pens.
It's because what he really wants in life is to be with his friends. He doesn't want to be alone anymore. And just like how the power of love provides an anchor across space and time in Interstellar, Loki's deep connection with these people, his friends, will serve as the temporal anchor to help him control his time slipping. As Loki says, it's not about where, when, or why.
It's about who.
What?
So just how deep is Loki's connection to these people? Well, it must be pretty deep and pretty important, considering that OB or AD or whatever you want to call him had that all-important question, who, circled on a note on his giant chalkboard full of story notes. So let's just hope that his other note about sacrifice doesn't wind up becoming Chekhov's post-it in the season finale. Now, the episode ends with Loki time-slipping back to the Time Variance Authority in the control room overlooking the temporal loom before its destruction. The real question, though, is how far back will Loki go? Will he need to be the one to take the long walk out to the temporal loom to repair it this time around?
I mean, Loki's really gonna have to hoof it then, right?
Or will he have to go back even further and ensure that Victor Timely isn't a Johnny-come-lately taking an ill-advised cocoa break? It seems like Loki is constructing a Mobius strip of its very own with these intersecting bootstrap paradoxes. He Who Remains already engineered one between Victor Timely and OB. They mutually inspired each other to bring the TVA into existence. But Loki also inspired AD Doug to recreate OB's writings in the TVA guidebook so he could get the gang back together to help him realize what was truly important so he can prevent the temporal loop from exploding in the first place. It's a series of interconnected loops that give you a headache if you think about them for too long.
Time travel!
The bigger question here is how far back will Loki need to go to save the TVA? Is it actually possible to save the TVA and liberate it from the cruel influence of He Who Remains? Or was this a part of He Who Remains' Kang-tingency plan all along? Will saving the TVA ensure that another Kang variant rises like a harbinger of doom and assumes direct control? Only time will tell, and we're hoping that we'll get answers for all time always next week in the season finale. For now though, folks, there you have it. That's everything you need to know about Loki Episode 5. We'll have even more deep dives for you over on Nerdist in the days ahead. In the meantime though, tell us, what did you think of this episode? Did you spot anything that we missed?
The TVA is gone.
I think you mean ATV, and no, you're in luck. We got in 2 of them last week.
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, make sure you stay tuned to Nerdist.com.